There is a thing the Blockbuster story does every time it gets told. It starts with the failure. It works backward from the bankruptcy in 2010, from the single remaining store in Bend, Oregon, from the moment Blockbuster laughed at Netflix's $50 million offer in 2000. It assembles the evidence in the order that makes the ending look inevitable, and then it delivers the lesson. Complacent incumbents ignore disruption. Don't be Blockbuster. What gets left out of this version, and this is the thing nobody admits when a failure narrative succeeds, is everything that Blockbuster actually understood about its customers that its disruptors for years genuinely did not. At the time of the Netflix offer, Blockbuster had about 4,300 stores in the US, and revenues of nearly $5 billion compared to only $36 million for Netflix. The laughter in that room was not the laughter of arrogance meeting ignorance. It was the laughter of a company that had spent 15 years building a business around a specific and accurate understanding of how most Americans wanted to rent movies, and that was being offered the chance to acquire a company that served a different segment of that market, at a price that reflected accurately how small that segment was in 2000. The standard lesson of the Blockbuster story, complacency kills, is not wrong. But it is attached to a version of the story that quietly removes everything that was right about Blockbuster's model, because the things that were right don't fit into the lesson being taught. This episode is about what Blockbuster actually understood, not to rehabilitate a company that failed, but because understanding what worked is the only way to understand specifically what failed. Blockbuster expanded rapidly, becoming the go-to destination for movie rentals. At its height, the company operated more than 9,000 stores worldwide, employed over 80,000 people, and generated billions in annual revenue. In fact, Blockbuster's brand was synonymous with Friday night entertainment. This did not happen by accident, and it did not happen because Blockbuster was simply the only option. In the 1990s, there were thousands of independent video rental stores across the United States. Blockbuster competed against them and won, not primarily on price but on something more specific. A standardized, predictable experience that independent stores couldn't replicate at scale. Blockbuster understood that the video rental experience was not primarily about the catalog. Most customers, most of the time, wanted to see something new that had come out that week, not a deep cut from 1987. Blockbuster's inventory model was built around maximizing the availability of new releases at the moment of peak demand. The company's supply chain and revenue-sharing agreements with studios, a genuine innovation, negotiated under the leadership of CEO John Antioco, were specifically designed to put more copies of new releases on the shelf on Friday than any independent could afford to stock. The experience that Blockbuster had built was also social in a way that gets entirely erased from the failure narrative. Customers flocked to Blockbuster stores to browse shelves of VHS tapes and later DVDs, rent games, and stock up on snacks. The Friday night trip to Blockbuster was, for a specific and large segment of the American consumer market, a deliberate recreational activity rather than a chore. It was the experience of being surrounded by movies, of having to choose, of discovering something you hadn't planned to watch. An experience that for those customers had genuine value that neither mail-based nor eventually streaming alternatives fully replicated. Have you ever watched a company's actual competitive advantages get written out of its failure narrative? Because those advantages don't fit the lesson the story is supposed to teach. Leave a comment. Netflix initially appealed largely to a different segment of customers than Blockbuster, broadly film buffs, who were willing to wait for a wider variety of films rather than customers who wanted hit films as soon as possible. This is the distinction that is almost entirely absent from the standard Blockbuster story, and it's the distinction that makes the 2000 laughter more understandable than the conventional narrative allows. Netflix in 2000 was not competing for the Friday night movie rental customer. It was competing for the patient film enthusiast who wanted access to titles that Blockbuster didn't stock because the demand didn't justify the shelf space. These are genuinely different customers with genuinely different needs. Blockbuster's model served one of them extraordinarily well. Netflix's early model served the other. The assumption that Netflix was an obvious threat to Blockbuster's core customer in 2000, the assumption that makes the laughter look like blindness, requires projecting the streaming service of 2010 onto the mail-order DVD company of 2000, and that projection wasn't available to anyone making decisions in real time. As late as 2002, a Blockbuster spokesperson stated that the company did not see Netflix's business model as being viable in the long term, and that Netflix was serving a niche market. This assessment was not entirely wrong. It was wrong about the trajectory, about the fact that broadband penetration would eventually make streaming viable for the core customer, not just the patient enthusiast, but it was not wrong about what Netflix was actually offering in 2002. The thing nobody admits when a failure narrative succeeds is this: the company that failed usually understood something real about its market, and the understanding was usually accurate right up until the moment it wasn't, which is not the same as having been wrong all along. If distinguishing between was wrong and became wrong at a specific moment for a specific reason is the level of analytical precision you come here for, the like is the direct signal. The late fee. This is the detail that does more work in the Blockbuster failure narrative than almost any other single fact, and it is consistently misrepresented in the telling. Late fees comprised a large portion of Blockbuster's profits. It was an unpleasant experience that actually drove people away from the business. This is accurate. Late fees were also, for Blockbuster, a functional solution to a real operational problem. A store with a fixed inventory of physical media needs a mechanism to ensure that the media returns in time to be available for the next customer. Late fees were the price of that mechanism. Netflix's elimination of late fees was not a simple improvement over Blockbuster. It required a different underlying model, mail-based rather than store-based, that made the return timing problem disappear because there was no other customer waiting for the same physical disc on the same shelf. The elimination of late fees was, for Netflix, not a policy choice. It was a structural consequence of a different distribution model. When Antioco eliminated late fees at Blockbuster, he was attempting to replicate the customer experience benefit of a structural advantage that Netflix had without the structural change that had made the advantage possible. The result was the elimination of hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue without the cost structure that would have allowed the company to absorb that loss. The board's response, removing Antioco and reversing the policy, was financially rational and strategically catastrophic. What Blockbuster understood, same-day new release availability, the social experience of physical browsing, the operational discipline of a scaled national retail network, was real and valuable. What it couldn't do was translate that understanding into a response to a competitor, whose structural advantages made the translation impossible without giving up the thing Blockbuster understood best. The thing nobody admits when a plan succeeds is the same thing nobody admits when the plan that replaced it fails. That success contains assumptions about conditions that may not last, and that the assumptions look like wisdom right up until the moment they stop being true. Blockbuster understood its customers. It understood with genuine precision what the majority of Americans wanted from a video rental experience in the 1990s. That understanding was the foundation of a $6 billion business. It was also the foundation of a strategic apparatus. The store network, the inventory model, the franchise relationships, the late fee revenue, that was optimized for a specific set of conditions and that could not easily be restructured when those conditions changed. The practical thing, when evaluating any successful strategy, the question is not only why does this work, it is what conditions does this strategy require in order to keep working, and which of those conditions are changing. Blockbuster's answer to the first question was very good. The answer to the second question arrived in 2006 and 2007, when broadband penetration reached the level that made streaming viable for the core customer rather than just the patient enthusiast. By the time the condition change was undeniable, the strategy that had been optimized for the old conditions had become the thing making it hardest to respond to the new ones. The next episode looks at a case where the plan succeeded by every available measure, and where what was happening behind the success was the thing that would eventually end it. The success, in this case, was the problem. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical Stoicism.